Hi guys, welcome back to Andy Narrates. Here we review stories that beautiful people like yourselves post on the internet. Today's story's title goes like this. Parents spend my entire wedding fund on my brother's third wedding and tell me they have nothing for me. So I get married in private without them. Now they want me to get married again, just because they weren't invited. So I'll try to keep this short. About 8 months ago, my boyfriend proposed to me. My boyfriend Andy, 27 male, and I, 27 female, have been together for the last 2 years. We met through work, and before him, I'd only ever dated another guy. My ex from high school, who cheated on me and dumped me a day before my 21st birthday. We'd been together for almost 6 years, so I took that really hard. Between my ex and Andy, I was single and didn't date anyone because I'd sworn off men completely after the cheating debacle. I also have an older brother, Peter, 31 male, who is somewhat of a wedding addict. He first got married at 22 to his college girlfriend, but that went south in a year. He got divorced at 23. Then at 27, he got married again to this woman he'd met at work, but he ended up cheating on her with his boss and his now wife, Miranda, 35 female. He got married for a third time, as soon as his second divorce came through. All his weddings have been lavish, and I'd assumed that our parents had only paid for his first wedding because he could afford to pay for the next two. He worked in the marketing department in a firm, and now he's the head of the department, thanks to his wife who's the boss. Her dad is pretty connected, so nobody can say anything to her either, and she just does whatever she wants. Seems unfair, but hold your horses, because it's about to get a lot more unfair. So I'd assumed that because my brother had already had the free wedding experience once, he'd probably paid for it himself the next 2 times, but apparently not. I found out about it back then when I got engaged, and I spoke to my parents about the wedding fund they'd set aside for me. They'd always told me and my brother both that all our major expenses would always be taken care of. My dad's a neurosurgeon, and my mom's a businesswoman, so money was never something that I had to worry about growing up. So, naturally, when I approached my parents for the wedding fund, I expected them to have some money set aside for me, but instead, I was told that they had nothing left for me because apparently they'd blown through both funds because they'd paid for all my brother's 3 extravagant weddings. At least on the third one, they had Miranda to split the cost with, but the first 2 were all them. Not just that, they'd also taken money out of my wedding fund to pay for his honeymoons. So they had no money for me, and now that they were nearing their 50s, they had to think about their retirement as well, and couldn't just afford to spend all the remaining money on my wedding. I was shocked when I learned the truth, and I remember arguing with them about it that day that I visited them, but they told me that they had tried to save for me, but decided that it'd be a waste when I broke up with my college boyfriend and then didn't date anyone for years after that. They thought I was off man, so they didn't feel the need to save for me. My mother's exact words were, quote, "We thought you'd stop looking because of how depressed you seemed, so if you'd wanted us to save for your wedding, you should have put yourself out there more often." End quote. That's pretty much the day I stopped speaking to them the way I used to before. I could forgive them for not having any money for my wedding, but I couldn't forgive the fact that they tried to turn this around on me and make this seem like it was my fault. I'd been cheated on by a guy that I'd been seeing for 6 years, and they knew that, but they still chose to make me feel like crap about what happened and act like it was my fault that I wanted to be single for years after that. I'd even taken things slow with Andy at first, but when I realized that he was nothing like my ex, I let my guard down. It wasn't as if my parents weren't aware of how serious Andy and I were about each other. He'd met them plenty of times, and they seemed to get along well. My parents had even met Andy's parents, and there was just no way that they hadn't guessed that, eventually, he and I would get married. So, at least that should have been a sign for them to start saving again, but they'd instead thought that it was more important for them to go on expensive vacations because they didn't think saving for my wedding was a priority anymore. You guys may think I'm being whiny and ungrateful, but it's unfair when you've been promised something and then suddenly your parents just turn around and tell you whatever they promised was in the past, and I shouldn't hold out hope anymore. It's even more unfair when you realize that they were willing to keep their promises to your brother, but not you. Thrice for Peter and 0 times for me. So anyway, I started speaking to them less and less, and started downsizing my wedding to fit our budget once Andy and I realized that my parents won't be contributing. They tried to keep in touch and acted as if everything was normal, but I didn't meet them for the last 8 months after the discussion of the wedding fund, and every time they'd ask me to visit or asked if they could visit, I would blow them off. That should have been enough of a hint to them that I didn't want to speak to them anymore. The only reason I didn't go no contact was because my friend's dad passed away from a heart attack in the past, but she didn't find out until he was gone because he'd gone no contact with her family and they couldn't find a way to contact her. And I was terrified of that happening, so I just kept contact to a minimum. As for my brother and I, we'd pretty much stopped talking after we moved out. He and I were never really close growing up, and I wasn't even invited to his 3rd wedding. Miranda had contacted me to apologize because she'd only found out that Peter even had a younger sister after their engagement. My parents didn't tell me anything about my brother's life and vice versa, which was fine. I preferred it that way. We were essentially just strangers who'd grown up in the same house. So anyway, long story short, my parents weren't invited to my wedding, and neither was my brother. It was an intimate ceremony that took place a couple of weeks ago. I got married in the presence of a few selected relatives who I knew wouldn't tell my parents until I was ready, and a couple of my friends and coworkers. Andy's parents were there too. My aunt, my dad's older sister, walked me down the aisle because she and I had always had a good connection. I knew that I could trust her not to tell my parents until I told them myself, and I was right. My parents didn't find out about the wedding until about a week ago, when Andy and I put the photos of our wedding on social media. My parents aren't on social media, but my brother is, and we do follow one another. Our personal indifference to each other's lives shouldn't reflect in our follower count, so I'm guessing it was he who told our parents. Or even if he hadn't, they probably would have found out anyway because other members of my family also followed me. When they found out, my parents were naturally livid and decided to call me that day itself to yell at me about how I'd insult them by not inviting them to my wedding. I didn't know why they even expected to be invited when I hadn't spoken to them for months properly and hadn't even met with them. So, I reminded them of the discussion that we had about the wedding fund and told them that they let me down, so I didn't invite them. It was nothing more and nothing less than that. That infuriated them even more, and they demanded that I have another ceremony and I do it the quote-unquote right way this time. By this, they meant that they wanted me to have another wedding and scale it up so they could be invited and also invite their own friends and a bunch of other people. My dad wanted to walk me down the aisle and have photos of that, and we could pretend that the first wedding was just a quote-unquote rehearsal or something. First of all, no way in hell was I going to do that. Secondly, the entitlement to even expect your daughter to go to the lengths of arranging a second wedding just so you can show the world that you were invited takes some crazy guts, so I'll give them that. They definitely had the audacity. I told them that none of that was happening and that I had no intention of having multiple weddings. I wasn't my brother. I hung up on them before they could say anything to me, but they still kept texting me after that and kept trying to make me feel bad for not inviting them. My mother texted me a couple of hours back saying that my dad has had a chest pain for days because he's so upset that I didn't invite him to my wedding. He's refusing to take his meds and believes that this is his punishment for treating me badly. And my mother says that the only way for me to fix this is to talk to him and promise him that I'll have another wedding so that he doesn't feel humiliated. I don't know what to do now, because she's put me in a tough spot. Obviously, I don't want to go through the trouble of organizing a second wedding just for the show, and I don't even know if they will pay for it or not, but I also can't just let my dad suffer. Am I the a-hole for not inviting my parents to my wedding after they blew my entire wedding fund on my brother's third wedding? Okay, so I didn't go ahead with the idea of a second wedding. It's just ridiculous, and yeah, my dad's completely fine. He and my mom had just come up with some sick plan to guilt trip me and force me to redo my wedding so that they could attend. I found out when I called our cook. I knew that there was a special diet that my mother made my dad stick to whenever he had any health issues because, despite being a neurosurgeon, he doesn't take very good care of his own health. So, I thought about it a little, and when I asked our family cook, she told me that it's been business as usual around the household and there has been no difference in my dad's behavior or health. So, they'd been lying to me. I was so mad that I actually did block them this time because what they'd done was unacceptable. They'd been toying with my feelings over a wedding that they honestly didn't even deserve to attend. I might not have had a lot of family attending, but I can tell you guys for sure that none of the people who were actually invited would have ever tried to emotionally blackmail me into believing that they were sick or something just to get what they wanted out of me. I've blocked Peter as well for good measure because I don't want him to bother me either. All of them can go to hell. It's been 3 weeks since the wedding, and today I found out that my parents had been telling everyone in the family that they were invited but were unable to attend because my dad was sick. Yep, they're using that excuse again. Now, I wouldn't have cared, but some of the relatives that I actually had invited asked me if this was true, because otherwise they'd just been lying for no reason, and that'd make them feel pretty stupid. So, yesterday, Andy and I decided to put out a joint statement that my parents were in fact not invited. Mostly, it was out of spite, because they'd been treating me like absolute crap, and now, to add to that list, they'd added lies about me. I know this will just lead to more drama, but at this point I don't really care. They're gonna create drama anyway, so I might as well clear my name, because I don't want my family to believe that I just forced them to lie and keep secrets from my parents for no apparent reason. That'll just make me look like a jerk. Hey, so this is not related to my parents but my brother. Peter and Miranda recently contacted me after we posted that our parents were not invited to my wedding. They told me that they'd heard the entire story of what had happened from my parents, and now they wanted to make amends by paying me back the money that we'd spent on our wedding because they felt bad. I feel like I should mention that this was on a video call that Miranda had organized, and she did most of the talking. She kept saying Peter and I, but I could tell very clearly from Peter's face that he was not on board with this, and it was in fact only Miranda who had a conscience. She even told me that the reason I hadn't been invited to their wedding was that Peter had told me that I had exams, which she only learned recently was not true. I don't know what the woman sees in my brother because she's a lot smarter, more successful, and seems to be a better human being in general too. We had a lengthy discussion, and I told her that I don't want the money from her because at the end of the day, that money had been promised to me by my parents and not her, so there's no real reason for her to offer to pay. I was glad that she'd been sweet enough to even offer, but I couldn't accept it. She kept apologizing to me for not inviting me to their wedding, but again, that was also not on her, and it was mostly Peter who screwed up. At least he had the decency to look ashamed at that and even mumbled an apology, but managed to dodge that too by putting the blame on our parents entirely and saying that if they just raised us to be a real family, then we wouldn't be so distant, and Miranda seemed to approve of that explanation. Even though Peter and I were just as responsible for the distance between us as our parents were. He never put in an effort to connect with his sister, and neither did I. Both of us pretended that we didn't have a sibling at all, so it was our fault too. But he didn't want to come off as the bad guy in front of Miranda, so our parents were the only bad guys for now. So, my parents are back on their BS once more. This time, they're choosing to play the victims even better now and send me an email with an invoice of all the money they'd spent on me over the years on my education. They told me that since I decided to humiliate them in public and pretend that they were bad parents, they would play the role and now wanted me to pay them back for educating me. I just sent back nothing but a picture of my middle finger because that's how irritated I was by them. They'd been playing the victim for ages now, and I'm not sure how much more of this I can take. I even had a fight with Peter the other day when he texted me after the video call to thank me for not accepting the money and also for not making a big deal out of the wedding invitation that I didn't receive because of him. That was okay, and I wouldn't have snapped at him if he'd limit his text to just that. But he decided to take it one step ahead and said that he wished our parents had more of a role to play in making our family actually feel like one, instead of just a bunch of people who used to be roommates. That really rubbed me the wrong way, because even he was guilty of that, like I'd said in my last post. So I told him off and said that that is all his childhood. He'd pretended that he never had a sister, and that continued into adulthood, and occasionally, our parents actually had tried to make us get along, but he'd never been interested, and that's why neither did I even try to get along with him. He then started getting unnecessarily defensive, and our conversation ended in a fight and with me getting blocked. I'd unblocked him after the call, but then there was no point to that evidently. I just wish that I had a better and more normal family, and not this bunch of unreasonable, irrational weirdos who can't seem to care about anything but themselves. At times like these, I am most thankful for Andy and my in-laws, who are a lot more normal and functional than my folks. They have their fair share of ups and downs and fight a lot too, but they always make up, and their arguments aren't this crazy either. I'm just so sick of my family. Okay, hey y'all, so this is gonna be a long update. It's been 4 days since my last update, and today, my parents finally came to visit me. All other ways to reach me had been blocked, so now they had no other option but to come to talk to me in person. I could have turned them away from the door itself, but I chose to let them in, so there'd be an end to this once and for all. They were just as arrogant and snooty when they came by as they had been as they usually were, and showed no signs of being willing to apologize. So I prepared myself mentally to have one of the most infuriating and frustrating conversations of my life ever. They started off by telling me that they'd chosen to ignore my disgusting show of stupidity the other day when I'd responded to their email, which I have to say, most people actually found it amusing and downright hilarious, but I guess to my parents, it would be quite offensive. They'd chosen to ignore it, but now they were giving me one last and final chance to make things right with them, or else I'd be disinherited by them. Honestly, I was just surprised that they even had something for me in the will, because I just assumed that they'd be more concerned with what my brother would inherit. I told them that I couldn't give a less of a damn about whether they were offended or not, and that I had absolutely no intention of making anything right with them. I wasn't gonna have a fake wedding for a second time, all because my parents were offended they hadn't been invited to the wedding. If they were upset about it, then too bad. They should have thought about that before spending my wedding fund on my brother's weddings, and then trying to gaslight me into believing that this was somehow my own fault because I didn't date a guy after my ex cheated on me. They were ridiculously entitled, and someone needed to knock them down a peg, and unfortunately, it turns out the job had fallen to me, but I was glad to do it. After I was done telling them off, my mother told me that I was being insolent and demanded that I apologize. But I told them that I really and genuinely didn't care what they thought of me anymore, so they could beg for an apology for as long as they wanted, but I wasn't gonna change my mind. My dad then intervened and told me that he wasn't bluffing and that he was actually going to cut me out of the will, but I just leaned back in my chair and told them to go ahead as nonchalantly as I could, which seemed to piss them off even more. They kept yelling at me, and at one point, I just got bored, so I decided to grab my phone and started going through memes. That really ticked them off, and my dad smacked my phone out of my hand. So, That's when I decided that I'd had enough and told them that they needed to leave right now or else I'd call the police. Then they finally left, but not before my dad reminded me that I was being disinherited and that I wouldn't get a single dime out of my inheritance. Big whoop. They're gone now, thankfully, and I don't have to deal with them for a while, hopefully. Andy wasn't at home today because his mom had a doctor's appointment and he'd promised that he would accompany her, so he left and I could only tell him what happened once he came back. I didn't want him to worry about me, so I didn't tell him while he was away, but he told me that the next time they show up, I should just lock the doors and not let them in and call him instantly. It was sweet how worried he was, but he doesn't need to. My parents are too superficial and fake to do anything to me because they're too worried about how the world sees them and won't even lay a finger on me out of fear that I might expose them. But yeah, I'm not gonna let them into my home or my life again after today. This was the end, hopefully. I received a call from my dad's lawyer today, and I was told that I am not inheriting anything from my parents after my parents' demise. He called me to warn me one last time that if I didn't organize a wedding another time with my parents in attendance, this change in the will would be finalized and there would be no saving me after that. I didn't care, so I told the guy to go ahead and do whatever my parents said because another wedding ain't happening. It's absurd that my parents even took this to such lengths, but I guess I can't really expect any better from them. They also keep saying this is my last warning and then come back again and again. It's like they want me to insult them. And it's hilarious that they think that they can just buy me out. I'm not gonna become a sellout at the idea of inheritance because I'm pretty successful myself, and so is Andy. Well, yeah, maybe we're not exactly as rich as my parents yet, but we'll get there with time, so I don't feel bad about the inheritance. Especially if it was gonna come at the cost of my dignity, because really, having a second wedding just to satisfy their ego would have been way beneath my dignity. Alright guys, that was a wrap up for today's story. Thank you very much for listening. Go ahead and smash the like button for me and subscribe for more stories. Thank you again guys. We will be seeing you in the next one.